You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Have you ever gazed in wonder at the Great Pyramid? Have you marveled at the golden face of Tutankhamun? Or admired the delicate features of Queen Nefertiti? If you have, you'll probably like the History of Egypt podcast. Every week, we explore tales of this ancient culture. The History of Egypt is available wherever you get your podcasting fix. Come, let me introduce you to the world of ancient Egypt.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 470th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast. As y'all will recall, by the end of the last episode, it was the first week of April 1864, and the Federals, both Army and Navy, were at Grand Ecore, a spot on the Red River upstream from Alexandria, Louisiana.
Major General Nathaniel Banks, the commander of the Federals' Red River expedition, had described his plan of campaign in terms of making a series of bounds, as in leaps and bounds. A bound to Alexandria, then a bound to Shreveport, then a bound into East Texas. Now, from Grand Ecore, it was time for Banks to determine the best route to take for his bound to Shreveport.
Banks' progress to Grand Ecore had been relatively easy, though time-consuming. Now it was April 3rd, and in 12 days, A.J. Smith's 10,000 soldiers were supposed to be transferred back to William Tecumseh Sherman.
With that rapidly approaching deadline, Banks had to make a decision quickly regarding the best route to approach Shreveport. He had been dismayed to discover that the maps acquired by his staff were different than those carried by the steamboat pilots who navigated up and down the Red River. Some showed roads not marked on others. The same was true for lakes, ponds, villages, and town locations. Depending on the map, a creek might be shown flowing in various directions, and often the same stream might have several different names.
With regard to the accuracy of the maps the Army was using, Banks' Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Charles Stone, consulted with Wellington Withenbury, the riverboat pilot we've mentioned before.
The Army was using La Tourette's map of Louisiana, which had been published in 1853 and portrayed the entire state on a single large sheet with very little detail. Army topographical engineers, under the direction of Colonel John S. Clark, had edited the map to identify features pertinent to the expedition. Clark was adept at making maps that Banks could understand. Banks, a political general, wasn't a professional soldier, and he appreciated Clark's beautiful maps, which were created using watercolors and colored inks and pencils. Banks and his staff regarded their copies of the La Tourette map as gospel, even though it wasn't terribly accurate, and it was often at odds with the field intelligence provided by the riverboat pilots and the Union cavalry.
For example, two maps in the National Archives, drawn by a Major Houston of Banks' staff and dated 1864, show two additional roads drawn in as single lines, following the Red River, one on the east bank and the other on the west bank. They were obviously drawn in either at the close of the campaign or soon afterward, since Banks didn't consider them when making his decision about how to approach Shreveport.
One of those river roads was the route the Confederate commander, Major General Richard Taylor, fully expected the Yankees would take north from Grand Ecore to Shreveport. And it seems certain Banks would have used it, if not for the convincing recommendations of riverboat pilot Withenbury for some other roads shown on the La Tourette map. Withenbury had spent at least 20 years piloting vessels up and down the Red River and knew every feature on or near it. Although he proudly proclaimed himself as a Union man to Porter, Banks, and later, on Capitol Hill during congressional testimony, he was also a businessman with a considerable financial interest in Red River cotton. In fact, after the campaign, he was listed as a claimant to some of the cotton seized by Porter's Union sailors. In any case, Withenbury knew his cotton interests in the area along the Red between Grand Ecore and Shreveport would be safe only if Banks marched north to Shreveport on a route that took him away from the river. That he didn't want to see his investment in the valuable white gold ruined when it was confiscated by the Yankees or go up in smoke when it was burned by the Confederates probably explains what Withenbury did next.
When asked about the roads leading to Shreveport, Withenbury did a bit of bait and switch, failing to mention any roads that followed the river northward, but instead describing in great detail the two roads shown on the La Tourette map, both of which bode far away from the Red, forming an irregular parenthesis.
Withenbury knew Banks wouldn't take the eastern road after he assured the federal commander that it would take 3 extra days to reach Shreveport by that route. As for the western route, the Pleasant Hill to Mansfield Road, Withenbury admitted that it would take the Army away from the river and the support of the Navy, but, he sought to convince Banks, it was by far the best option for the bound to Shreveport.
Banks was convinced and decided the Army would march north to Shreveport on the western road. Thanks to Withenbury's sleight of hand, it seems Banks didn't realize he instead could have taken a road that closely followed the course of the Red and would have allowed the Navy's gunboats to provide close support for the Army.
Moving away from the river and the Navy's support wasn't ideal, but Banks believed the risk was small, since he was certain the rebels wouldn't cause him any problems on the Army's march to Shreveport. The day after making his decision to follow Withenbury's advice, Banks wrote a letter to his wife telling her that, quote, "The enemy retreats before us and will not fight a battle this side of Shreveport, if then."
Nathaniel Banks had made his decision to march away from the Red, but David Dixon Porter, with his gunboats and the Army transport vessels, of course had to follow the river north to Shreveport.
And once Porter began his move toward Shreveport, he wrote to William Tecumseh Sherman that he could see a road that ran along the west bank of the river, along with herds of cattle grazing and fields filled with corn. He told Sherman, quote, "It struck me very forcibly that this would have been the route for the Army, where they could have traveled, the country supporting them as they proceeded along. The roads are good, wide fields on all sides, a river protecting the right flank of the Army, and gunboats in company."
But by then it was too late. Withenbury's advice to Banks changed the course of the campaign. By neglecting to tell Banks that the Army could have followed the river northward, instead allowing the Yankee general to believe there were only the two roads that bode away from the Red, Withenbury saved his cotton investments and at the same time appeared to still be a good Union man.
Given his belief that there were only the two roads, Banks made the correct choice between them, but his failure to order either a naval or cavalry reconnaissance of the area north of Grand Ecore was unforgivable. In any case, once Banks decided to take the western road, moving inland away from the Red, he and Porter agreed to meet at a point opposite Springfield Landing in northern DeSoto Parish on April 10th. The landing was about 60 miles by road and slightly over 100 river miles north of Grand Ecore. Banks would march out of Grand Ecore on April 6th, and Porter would steam upriver the next day.
Porter had to carefully consider which vessels to take with him. The stretch of the Red between Grand Ecore and Shreveport was called the Narrows by the riverboat pilots, with its winding course contorted by many tight bends.
Porter realized that if Eastport grounded in one of those tight bends, it would be all but impossible to free the massive gunboat, so he decided to leave her behind at Grand Ecore. In the end, Porter took only his lightest draft vessels upriver: 2 monitors, 1 timberclad, 2 tinclads, and 1 ironclad. He made the tinclad USS Cricket his flagship. The half-dozen gunboats accompanied 20 Army transports loaded with supplies and 2,300 soldiers.
Meanwhile, Nathaniel Banks had the Army's order of march just the way he wanted it. The Union cavalry would form up and ride out on the morning of April 6th. Albert Lee's horsemen would be followed by their 300 supply and ordnance wagons.
Some of the 2,500 black troops of the Corps d'Afrique were assigned to guard the cavalry's wagons, although most would be with the main wagon train. In any case, following the cavalry's wagons and guards were the 15,000 infantry and artillerymen under Banks' field commander, William Buell Franklin. Banks and Franklin rode at the head of this contingent, whose order of march was the 2 13th Corps divisions, then 1 division of 19th Corps troops.
Behind them in the line of march were Franklin's 700 supply and ordnance wagons. Apparently, neither Franklin nor Banks were terribly concerned about the fact that, with everyone on one road, the 300 wagons to the front of the infantry and 700 wagons to their rear would effectively box in the marchers, so that they would have trouble assisting the Union cavalry if there was trouble to the front of the column. And with so many wagons immediately to their rear, they would have difficulty falling back if it came to that.
Then A.J. Smith was following the 700 wagons with around 7,500 of his 16th Corps men. Relegated to eating the dust of the entire column, Smith delayed leaving Grand Ecore until the next day. On the march, the entire column, using a single road, quickly resembled a giant accordion, as frequent, fitful starts and stops slowed progress forward to a crawl. As men, horses, wagons, and guns were forced to halt frequently, waiting to continue, then hustle, trying to maintain contact with those ahead, before coming to a halt once again when they ran up against another stoppage.
Up and down the column, frustration mounted and tempers flared. The terrain only added to the men's exasperation. The red sand that gave the Red River its name gave way to red clay, which, though hard when dry, turned slick and stuck to everything when wet. It made movement tiring and the footing treacherous.
The long stretches of cotton fields the troops had grown accustomed to seeing were gone, replaced by seemingly endless stretches of thick, piney woods, which formed a green cathedral, with the road its only aisle. After torrential rains on April 7th, a reporter for the Philadelphia Press newspaper remarked that the single road seemed, quote, more like a broad, deep ditch than anything else.
He added that he had, quote, ridden for 50 miles into the heart of this pine country, and from the beginning to the end of the journey there was nothing but a dense, impenetrable forest, traversed by a few narrow roads, with no signs of life of civilization beyond occasional log houses and half-cleared plantations.
One Union cavalry trooper called the area a, quote-unquote, howling wilderness. Thirst tormented the Yankees. They found very little water that wasn't falling from the sky, and once that hit the earth, the rainwater became as bright red as the wet clay they were marching in. The rain and mud ensured the Federals never moved faster than a crawl, and the column's various parts stretched out and pulled away from one another.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
As the Yankees made their way west from Grand Ecore and then north, on the Confederate side, Dick Taylor finally began receiving some much-needed reinforcements, although not all that he needed and requested.
About the time the Federals felt the first raindrops on April 7th, Major General Tom Greene was crossing the Sabine River into Louisiana at Logansport in DeSoto Parish, bringing several regiments of Texas cavalry to Taylor's aid. After joining Taylor at Pleasant Hill, Greene and his men rode out to find out what the Yankees were up to.
Taylor welcomed Greene's arrival, but was unhappy that he couldn't make a move against the Federals until more of the reinforcements he'd requested showed up. Department Commander E. Kirby Smith had vacillated about sending Confederate troops from Arkansas to help Taylor, since Smith knew that Frederick Steele, the Federal commander in Arkansas, was also a threat. But finally, realizing Banks represented the greater danger, Kirby Smith ordered most of his Arkansas infantry to move south to Shreveport.
These forces were small divisions commanded by Brigadier Generals Mosby Parsons and Thomas Churchill. Meanwhile, in Louisiana, Dick Taylor wanted to confront the Federals as far south as possible before they closed in on Shreveport. But Kirby Smith's delay in sending Parsons and Churchill meant Taylor's hands were tied, and he couldn't make his move until they arrived on the scene. He complained bitterly about the delay and about his supply troubles, and to the day he died, Dick Taylor would blame Kirby Smith for hamstringing him during the campaign with logistical difficulties and manpower problems.
The animosity between Dick Taylor and Kirby Smith showed clearly in their heated correspondence. Then, when the two men met at Mansfield on April 6th, their strained relationship kept them from agreeing on a plan as to how best to turn back the federal threat to Shreveport and East Texas.
Dick Taylor was appalled that Kirby Smith was still questioning whether Banks was a greater threat than Steele. Smith suggested all available forces be concentrated against Steele, or that the Confederate forces passively sit in the defenses of Shreveport and await Banks' arrival, or even that they should consider abandoning all of Louisiana and Arkansas and fight it out in East Texas. Dick Taylor could hardly believe what he was hearing, and he objected to every plan proposed by Kirby Smith.
When Kirby Smith left the April 6 meeting at Mansfield and returned to Shreveport without providing specific orders, Dick Taylor assumed he was free to do what he thought best. However, after returning to his headquarters, Kirby Smith decided to send Taylor instructions on April 8th about where and when to give battle. But as it turned out, those instructions arrived too late to influence the course of events. And really, even if Taylor had received them sooner, he probably would have ignored them.
While the Confederates were waffling, the Federal column was feeling its way west and then north. Albert Lee's horsemen led the column westward from Grand Ecore through the rolling red clay hills on the track that had been the Spanish Royal Road. After about 12 miles, they turned north at a stagecoach road intersection at which stood White's store. Just north of the store, the terrain opened briefly into bottomland with small streams where canteens could be filled. Then it climbed back into the seemingly endless hills and ridges. The next day, April 7th, the heavens opened and the rain poured down. But other than that, it appeared to the Federals much like the 6th, since the Confederate cavalry they encountered hadn't shown much interest in doing anything but light skirmishing. So it seemed like Nathaniel Banks was right, and perhaps the enemy wouldn't put up a fight before Shreveport, if then.
Early on the morning of the 7th, Albert Lee, at the head of the column, resumed the march with 3 of his 4 brigades of horsemen. Of his 10 regiments of cavalry, half were mounted infantry, and most were untested in battle. The road ran almost due north for about 12 miles, with very few curves and almost no homesteads. At noon, the Union horsemen reached the sleepy little village of Pleasant Hill.
Colonel John Clark, the topographical engineer, was riding with Albert Lee, and Clark later reported that the Union cavalry, with its wagon train in tow, ran into several regiments of Texas cavalry at Wilson's Farm, 3 miles north of Pleasant Hill. There, the rebels made a stand. The action included a charge by the Texans. The rebels eventually withdrew, but in the sharp fighting, which lasted about half an hour, the Yankees suffered around 70 casualties.
With the action at Wilson's Farm and the Confederate cavalry's unexpectedly aggressive tactics, both Clark and Lee sensed something had changed and tried to communicate their concern to William Buell Franklin. Albert Lee requested by messenger that his wagon train be sent back the column to join the infantry's, so that at least a division of foot soldiers could close up toward the front of the column and closely support his horsemen as they continued to lead the Federal advance up the road.
However, Franklin denied Lee's request out of hand. He refused to reposition the cavalry's wagons or to move any infantry up the column to directly support the Union horsemen. Even when Colonel Clark, who had gone back to confer with Franklin in person, voiced his agreement with Lee, Franklin still refused to budge. He told Clark that Lee would get infantry support if he needed it, but that Franklin would decide if he really needed it. Well, Clark next went to Nathaniel Banks to plead his case, and Banks, who, like Franklin, thought Lee was just suffering from jittery nerves, nonetheless ordered a single brigade of infantry to be moved up the column to support Lee's cavalry. The brigade was to come from the command of Brigadier General T.E.G. Ransom, who led the 13th Corps component of the expedition.
In response to Banks' order, Ransom instructed Colonel Frank Emerson's 1,200-man brigade of the 4th Division of 13th Corps to march forward and support the Union horsemen. The division commander, Colonel William Landrum, decided to accompany the brigade the next day, the 8th, when it would move forward to support the cavalry.
Meanwhile, Clark rode back to Albert Lee and told him of Franklin's response, but said that Banks was nevertheless sending him some infantry support tomorrow. Lee cautiously advanced another 3 miles beyond Wilson's Farm and decided to halt for the evening. His cavalry had covered 15 miles on the 7th, fought a sharp action, and he thought his men deserved a rest. But Franklin sent word that Lee was to continue moving as far as possible, ostensibly so that the Union infantry could start marching in the morning without having to wait for the cavalry's wagons to move off.
Franklin was unhappy with Clark for going over his head directly to Banks earlier in the day, so the order keeping the cavalrymen moving on the evening of the 7th may have been Franklin's petty way of expressing his displeasure with the situation. But be that as it may, Albert Lee got his men back in the saddle and began riding up the road once again.
The Union horsemen were tired, thirsty, and on edge. After receiving Franklin's order to push forward as far as possible that evening, Albert Lee slowly advanced another 4 miles to Carroll's Mill. This grist mill on a small stream served the surrounding area and was the first one in the region to use a water wheel. As the Federal horsemen neared the mill, Tom Green's Texas cavalry made another stand, forcing a brief skirmish in the dying light before they withdrew into the dark woods. Albert Lee finally called a halt for the night and posted pickets. He was sure the Confederates were up to something and was unhappy that no one, aside from Clark, seemed to take his concerns seriously. Lee later told Congress he was laughed at for insisting that they'd have a battle before they got to Shreveport.
At 3 o'clock on the morning of Friday, April 8th, Colonel Frank Emerson, as ordered, began his march with his 13th Corps Brigade to catch up with the Union cavalry at the head of the column. Division Commander Landrum went forward with Emerson.
At the head of the column, at sunrise, Albert Lee got the cavalry moving again, with Colonel Thomas Lucas's brigade in the lead. Almost immediately, they encountered Tom Green's Texas cavalry waiting for them. Lee ordered Lucas to dismount one of his regiments and deploy them as skirmishers, while 2 of Emerson's infantry regiments came up in support.
Unknown to the Federals, Tom Green had been ordered by Dick Taylor to contest every foot of the Yankee advance on the morning of the 8th, in order to buy time for Taylor to prepare a surprise for the enemy.
Exactly. But meanwhile, on the Federal side, T.E.G. Ransom, who led the 13th Corps component of the expedition, began the day's march at 5:30 a.m. at Pleasant Hill, and 5 hours later reached what he thought was Bayou San Patricio, but was actually 10 Mile Bayou. Well, regardless, he stopped, according to his orders, after covering 10 miles, and his men were setting up camp, when Albert Lee asked for relief for Emerson's exhausted infantry at the head of the column.
William Buell Franklin ordered Ransom to go forward personally with their brigade to see what was happening and to make sure that Emerson and Landrum returned to the main column. You see, Franklin still believed that whatever was going on was due only to Albert Lee's jittery nerves, and Franklin didn't see the need for a large body of infantry to be operating forward with the Union cavalry.
Well, Albert Lee had asked for relief for Emerson's brigade at the head of the column because, with constant heavy skirmishing, Lee and Emerson had managed to push the stubborn Confederate cavalry back about 6 miles on the morning of the 8th, but Emerson's Union infantry was about used up. Sometime between noon and 1 o'clock, Lee found himself at an intersection called Sabine Crossroads. Worryingly, the rebel cavalry had disappeared. Lee moved cautiously forward another 3/4 of a mile to the edge of a huge clearing in the piney woods, 800 yards deep and 1,200 yards across, at the slope of a ridge called Honeycutt Hill. Confederate skirmishers were there in force, but as Lee's horsemen and Emerson's infantry advanced, the rebels gave way and pulled back, and the Federals moved forward to take the high ground. But as the Yankees crested Honeycutt Hill, they suddenly saw thousands of Confederates, what seemed like every rebel west of the Mississippi River, drawn up in line of battle across their front, on both sides of the road, and extending down and past their right flank. So they may have laughed at him, but the astonishing sight was confirmation that Albert Lee had been right. Nathaniel Banks was going to have to fight a battle before the Confederates let him get to Shreveport.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is One Damn Blunder from Beginning to End, The Red River Campaign of 1864 by Gary Dillard Joyner.
If you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org, you'll find a complete list of all of our book recommendations, including One Damn Blunder from Beginning to End, The Red River Campaign of 1864 by Gary Dillard Joyner.
You'll also find information on how to join the Strawfit Brigade over on Patreon and support the podcast in that way, just like Alan T. and William D. did recently.
Well, thanks to them, and thanks also to Clark D. for his donation. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.